Andressa Pellanda is the general coordinator of the Brazilian campaign for right to education. Andressa is part of the steering committee of the Latin America campaign for the right to education. She is also affiliated with the National Association for Research in Education Financing, FINDUCA, if I spell it good in Spanish. Andressa, my question to you, what is the state of funding for education in Brazil and Latin America, and how do you think the pandemic will be affected by that? How the budget, the finance will be affected by the pandemic? The floor over you.
Thank you, Refat. So, dear Refat, dear colleagues of coalitions from the right to education in the world, at my side today, and dear all. Latin America countries invest on average 4.5% of GDP in education. The amounts per student are well below the average for OECD countries. In this scenario, however, at a time before the pandemic, COVID-19 has profoundly affected our region. America is the continent most affected by the pandemic, with 17.4 million confirmed cases. Of the 10 countries with the highest number of cases in the world, 5, that is half of them, are countries in Latin America. Brazil is in third place with almost 5 million cases. What makes us occupy 50% of the 10 top countries that have responded worst to the COVID-19 crisis. The policy paradigm adopted globally in terms of economic development in recent decades, guided by liberalizing and austerity policies, caused tremendous damage to the world and in particular to Latin America. The countries of our region, with a traditionally hierarchical economic model, with less mobility and greatest vulnerability, were very sensitive to the economic policies implemented, hugely deepening social inequalities in a region that is already one of the most unequal in the world. This led to a weakening of social policies as a whole of the region and has been the scene of political upheavals and the rise of populist and authoritarian governments recently, challenging our democracies. And what does this have to do with education? Everything. If the scenario of education in the region was already fragile with underfunding, school exclusion, and low quality, the pandemic has come to aggravate the situation even further and deepen educational and social inequalities. In Brazil, there are more than 40 million students who depend on the National School Feeding Program, who went months without receiving this food, which guarantees, in many cases, their food and nutritional security. More than 60% of those 40 million have precarious access to internet or technologies such as computers and tablets, which has generated an immense exclusion in terms of school attendance in this pandemic period, which is far from being over, since there are no testing policies and prevention in progress. There are 2 million students whose schools do not have drinking water, 800,000 in schools without a sewage system, and 614,000 without a bathroom in the place they studied. Under these conditions, it will not be possible to resume face-to-face classes in safety. In Brazil, the scenario of lack of infrastructure and minimal policies to guarantee rights, including the right to education, has a name: Constitutional Amendment 95, known as the ceiling of expenditure, which froze social spending for 20 years in Brazil. Since the beginning of austerity policies, a loss of $2 billion has been recorded of which 7 billion in 2019 alone. One of the promises of the ceiling of expenses was the reduction of the gross public debt that did not materialize. On the contrary, it grew 16%. According to the light report of civil society of the 2030 Agenda Working Group in Brazil, Constitutional Amendment 95 is one of the main causes of being far from reaching the SDGs in the country. The National Education Plan, the backbone of education policy, is expected to reach 2024 at the end of its term, with 85% of its goals not met if we continue with the defunding policy. The good news was that the Fund for Maintenance and Development of Basic Education and Valorization of Education Professionals, the FUNDEB, was approved after huge mobilization from civil society and the education community and pressure of the Congress, contrary to the government cut agenda. The new fund should bring more resources to schools, teachers, students. Still, it's far from being enough to face the crisis within the crisis we are expecting. Given this scenario, we recommend that the governments redouble their efforts to implement the recently adopted International Committee regarding the financing of human rights to education, placing them within a broader framework of the struggle for tributary and fiscal justice, the graciousness of the education, and the fortification of the public systems of education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andressa. What other changes you expect to be? For example, in the future, do you think that the people will be more aware about this? Because sometimes all the government policies has been passed because sometimes the people, they don't know the details, the risky about their children education. What are the changes in Brazil and Latin America in general that you expect?
Thank you.
Andressa, for you.
So I think we have to have a economic and systemic change. So 3 main points that I highlight here. So the first one, tax justice, which is configured as one of the key elements to finance the realization of the human right to education, as well as other human rights. So the second point is medium and long-term recovery efforts that should continue to promote more political and fiscal space that allow increase and not reduction in social spending in public services, in addition to progressive taxation measures that collect sufficient revenue and distribute wealth fairly. And 3, it's necessary for the governments to account to the public about public expenses, protecting the resources and executing them in a transparent, egalitarian, and sensitive way. These are the 3 paths that we think are important for the states to comply with their obligation to make the maximum use of the available resources to ensure the progressive realization of all economic, social, and cultural rights, and so the right to education. And without an adequate public budget, no human right can be guaranteed. Here in Brazil, we just had the approval of the Fund for Basic Education, and in a chaotic scenario. And this was due to the cooperation of civil society and due to the pressure from the educational community and of the teachers to have fair fund for education. So I do believe it's possible, and we are here to prove it. So I'd like to thank you all for being together on this fight, and we'll keep fighting for the right to education for everyone. Thank you.
We'll fight together.